The transport ship Celestial Wing shuddered as another energy blast struck its hull. Zayla pressed her small claws against the viewport, watching the enemy vessels close in like hungry predators. At only 12 cycles old, she had never seen a real battle before, but she understood enough to know they were going to die. "Mama, are we going to be okay?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the ship's groaning metal and the panicked shouts of the crew. Matriarch Thyra's massive form coiled protectively around her daughter, golden scales catching the emergency lighting that bathed their passenger quarters in an eerie red glow. The ancient dragon's eyes held a sadness that spoke of too many wars, too many losses. "I don't know, little flame," she admitted, her telepathic voice gentle despite the chaos around them. "The Devourers have found us again." Zayla had heard whispers about the Devourers her entire short life. They were the nightmare that haunted every species in the known galaxy. Once they had been called the Hektar, a proud warrior race that had achieved remarkable technological advancement. But something had changed them, twisted them into something that consumed entire civilizations, leaving nothing but empty worlds in their wake. The ship lurched violently, throwing Zayla against her mother's warm flank. Through the viewport, she could see the sleek, black ships of the enemy fleet. They moved with an unnatural fluidity, as if the vessels themselves were alive. Weapon ports along their hulls glowed with a sickly green light that made her stomach turn. Captain Vex's voice crackled over the ship's communication system, his usual calm demeanor strained to the breaking point. "All passengers to emergency pods. Repeat, all passengers to emergency pods. We're taking heavy fire and cannot maintain shields much longer." Thyra rose to her full height, her magnificent wings spread wide despite the cramped quarters. "Come, daughter. We must reach the pods." But as they moved toward the corridor, an explosion rocked the ship so violently that the lights went out completely. Emergency power kicked in a moment later, but Zayla could smell the acrid scent of burning circuits and something worse, something that made her dragon senses recoil in instinctive fear. "Hull breach in Section 7, came another announcement. "Emergency pods 1 through 12 are offline." Thyra's mental voice carried a note of despair that chilled Zayla to her core. The dragon matriarch had lived for over 3,000 years, had survived the Great War, had seen the rise and fall of dozens civilizations. If her mother was afraid, then they were truly doomed. They made their way through corridors filled with smoke and panicking passengers. The Celestial Wing was a refugee transport, carrying survivors from the latest world to fall to the Devourers. Zayla saw faces of a dozen different species, all united in their terror. There were the crystalline Zephyrites, their normally harmonious chimes now discordant with fear. The plant-like Verdians huddled together, their bioluminescent patterns flashing in distress signals. Even the proud Centaurian warriors, with their 6 limbs and natural armor, looked defeated. "Pod 13 is still functional," Captain Vex's voice announced, "but it can only take 50 passengers. We have over 200 aboard." The implications hit everyone at once. They couldn't all escape. Someone would have to stay behind, and staying behind meant certain death. Zayla felt her mother's grip tighten protectively around her as they reached the emergency pod bay. A crowd had already gathered, and the tension was thick enough to cut with a blade. She could see the fear in everyone's eyes, but also something else, something that made her proud of the various species represented here. Despite their terror, they were trying to organize, trying to figure out how to save as many as possible. "The younglings go first," declared Commander Thos, a massive Krillian whose beetle-like carapace was scarred from countless battles. "Then, the elders who carry the knowledge of our peoples." "And who decides who else lives?" demanded Dr. Yelena, a Zephyrite whose crystalline form was flickering with angry red light. "My research could save millions if I can get it to the core worlds." The argument that followed was painful to witness. These were good beings, Zayla realized, but desperation was making them turn on each other. She had learned about this in her studies, how survival situations could bring out both the best and worst in any species. Another explosion, closer this time, ended the debate abruptly. Through the pod bay's reinforced windows, Zayla could see one of the Devourer's ships, positioning itself directly above them. Its main weapon was charging, a sphere of energy that would tear through their hull like paper. 30 seconds until that thing fires, Captain Vex announced over the comm. His voice was eerily calm now, the kind of calm that came with accepting the inevitable. That's when Zayla noticed the human. He was easy to miss at first, standing quietly near the back of the crowd. Humans were still relatively new to galactic civilization, having only achieved faster-than-light travel within the last century. Most species barely paid attention to them, considering them primitive and unremarkable compared to races that had been exploring the stars for millennia. This particular human was even less remarkable than most. He was short by human standards, maybe 5.5 feet tall, with brown hair that stuck up at odd angles, and clothes that were clearly work attire rather than the formal dress most passengers wore. His hands were stained with grease and oil, and he carried a battered toolbox that looked like it had seen better decades. But his eyes, Zayla noticed his eyes were different. While everyone else was panicking or arguing, the human was studying the pod with an intensity that reminded her of her mother when she was solving a particularly complex problem. He wasn't looking at the pod itself, but at the loading mechanism, the power couplings, the waste heat vents. "Wait," the human said suddenly, his voice cutting through the chaos with surprising authority despite its quiet tone. "I think I can get more people into that pod." The crowd turned to stare at him, and Zayla could feel the collective skepticism radiating from the group. Here was this unremarkable member of a species barely out of their own solar system, claiming he could solve a problem that the ship's engineers had already declared impossible. "The pod's life support is rated for 50 beings," Dr. Yelena said dismissively. "The mathematics are quite clear. The pod's life support is rated for 50 beings under normal circumstances," the human corrected, setting down his toolbox and popping it open. "But when not in normal circumstances, we just needed to work long enough to reach the nearest safe system." He pulled out a device that Zayla didn't recognize, some kind of scanner that he began running over the pod's external systems. The atmospheric recyclers are running at only 60% efficiency because they're calibrated for long-term use. If I can overclock them and bypass some of the safety limiters, we can pack in maybe 75 people. Commander Thaw snorted, a sound like grinding stone. "And when the systems overload and everyone suffocates, then everyone suffocates together instead of half of them dying when this ship gets vaporized," the human replied matter-of-factly. "Look, I'm not saying it's a great plan. I'm saying it's the only plan that gives everyone a chance." Another blast struck the ship, and the lights flickered ominously. Through the windows, they could see the Devourer weapon almost fully charged. How long would it take? Captain Vex's voice came over the comm. He had apparently been listening to their conversation. "Give me 10 minutes, the human said, already pulling components out of his toolbox. "Maybe 8 if someone can help me with the power couplings." "We don't have 10 minutes, Dr. Yelena protested. "That weapon will fire in 20 seconds. "Then, I guess we'd better get started," the human said calmly. What happened next would stay with Zayla for the rest of her life. Without any further discussion, the human simply went to work. His movements were precise and economical, like he had done this exact procedure 1,000 times before. He popped open access panels with tools that seemed designed specifically for this ship's systems, rerouted power conduits with modifications that looked improvised but somehow felt perfectly engineered. And people began to help him. It started with Commander Thos, whose massive claws were surprisingly delicate when it came to holding components in place. Then Dr. Yelena joined in, her crystalline form perfect for channeling and redirecting energy flows. Within moments, half the crowd was involved in the effort, following the human's quiet but confident instructions. Zayla watched in fascination as her mother moved forward to assist as well. Thyra's mental abilities allowed her to interface directly with the ship's computer systems, providing real-time feedback on the modifications the human was making. Interesting, her mother's telepathic voice carried a note of surprise. He's not just randomly bypassing safety systems. He's creating new feedback loops, essentially turning the pod into a more efficient but less stable version of itself. Will it work? Zayla asked. I don't know, Thyra admitted. But the mathematics are elegant. Dangerous, but elegant. The Devourer weapon fired just as the human was making the final connections. The energy beam struck the celestial wing amidships, and the entire vessel shuddered like a living thing in its death throes. Hull plates began to buckle, and the artificial gravity fluctuated wildly. Done, the human announced, wiping sweat from his forehead. Pods ready for emergency launch. Atmospheric recyclers are overclocked by 40%. Heat dissipation is rerouted through the secondary systems. And I convinced the computer that physics works differently than it actually does. You convinced the computer that physics works differently? Dr. Yelena asked, her crystalline form flickering with confusion. It's a human thing, the man said with a slight smile. Sometimes the best way to solve an impossible problem is to convince the problem that it's not impossible. They began loading people into the pod with desperate efficiency. Zayla found herself pressed between a Verdian family and a group of Zephyrite scholars, but the pod that had seemed impossibly cramped for 50 beings somehow accommodated all 203 passengers. Launching in 10 seconds, Captain Vex announced. Godspeed to all of you. The last thing Zayla saw before the pod's emergency systems engaged was the human, still standing near the access panel. He wasn't getting in the pod. Wait, she called out, but the pod's doors were already sealing. Through the small viewport, she saw him give a small wave before turning back to his toolbox. The pod launched with a violent acceleration that pressed everyone against its walls, and the celestial wing fell away behind them, breaking apart under the continued assault from the Devourer fleet. Why didn't he come with us? Zayla asked her mother as they watched the ship's final moments. Thyra's mental voice was thoughtful, because someone had to manually maintain the modifications he made to the pod systems. The overclocked atmospheric recyclers will need constant adjustment during our flight, or they'll burn out within an hour. As if to emphasize the point, they could hear the human's voice coming over the pod's internal communication system. He had somehow rigged a connection between his scanner and their systems, allowing him to monitor their life support remotely. Okay, folks, his calm voice filled the cramped pod. Everything's looking good so far. Atmospheric recyclers are holding steady at 137% normal efficiency. You should reach the Kepler station in about 6 hours. I'll keep an eye on things from here. From where? Dr. Yelena demanded. Your ship is breaking apart. There was a pause before the human answered. Yeah, that's definitely happening. But I got enough power to maintain the connection for a while, and honestly, there's nowhere else I'd rather be right now than making sure you all make it to safety. The pod fell silent except for the hum of overworked machinery. Zayla pressed her face to the viewport, watching as the celestial wing finally broke completely in half. The Devourer ships moved in to finish the job, their weapons turning the debris into cosmic dust. But the human's voice continued to come through the calm and reassuring, making tiny adjustments to their life support systems and offering quiet commentary on their journey. He told them about the stars they were passing, shared stories about his work as a mechanic on various space stations, and somehow managed to make their desperate escape feel almost routine. How is he still alive? Commander Thas wondered aloud. Emergency shelters, the human's voice answered, apparently hearing them clearly. Every ship this size has them scattered throughout the hull. They're designed to keep a few people alive for short periods during catastrophic system failures. I'm in one near the engineering section. Those shelters don't have long-range communication systems, Dr. Yelena pointed out. They do now, the human replied with obvious satisfaction. Amazing what you can accomplish with some spare wire, a couple of power cells, and a complete disregard for manufacturer warranties. 3 hours into their flight, the first of the overclocked systems began to fail. Zayla felt the air in the pod grow thinner, and several passengers began to show signs of distress. But before anyone could panic, The human's voice came over the comm with detailed instructions for a manual override that somehow kept them breathing. For hours in, the heat dissipation system started to overload. The temperature in the pod rose uncomfortably, but again, the human guided them through a series of adjustments that brought things back under control. 5 hours in, the power couplings he had modified began to spark and smoke. The human's voice walked them through a complex rerouting procedure that involved 3 different species working together in ways their respective physiologies had never been designed for. "How do you know all this?" Zayla's mother asked during one of these emergency repairs. The human was quiet for a long moment before answering. "I've spent my whole life fixing things that weren't supposed to break and making things work that weren't supposed to function. When you're human, you learn pretty quickly that the universe doesn't owe you anything, so you'd better be prepared to solve your own problems. But this," Thyra gestured around the pod with one wing, "this level of improvisation, this understanding of systems you've never seen before, this is beyond mere technical skill." "My species has a saying," the human replied. "Necessity is the mother of invention. But I prefer the corollary. Stubbornness is the father of solutions that shouldn't work but do anyway." As they approached their destination, Zayla found herself thinking about what she had witnessed. The human had saved them all, not through superior firepower or advanced technology, but through sheer ingenuity and an apparent refusal to accept that some problems were unsolvable. "Kepler Station is in visual range," the human announced, and Zayla could hear the exhaustion in his voice for the first time. "You should be in docking range in about 15 minutes. The station's rescue teams are already on their way to meet you." "What about you?" Zayla asked into the comm. There was another long pause. "I'm afraid this is where we part ways, little one. The emergency shelter's power is almost gone, and I've used up most of my air keeping your systems running. But that's okay. You're all safe, and that's what matters." The pod fell silent except for the sound of crying. Even the normally stoic Commander Thos seemed moved by the human's matter-of-fact acceptance of his fate. "What's your name?" Dr. Yelena asked suddenly. "Marcus," the human replied. "Marcus Chun. I'm a mechanical engineer, 3rd class, from the human colony on Proxima Centauri, and it's been my honor to help you all today." "Marcus Chun," Thyra repeated, her mental voice carrying a weight that Zayla had never heard before. "I will remember that name." "Marcus," Zayla said into the comm, pressing her small claws against the speaker. "Thank you. Thank you, little dragon," Marcus replied, and Zayla could hear the smile in his voice. "Take care of yourself out there. The galaxy's going to need more people like you if we're going to stop the Devourers." The communication cut out just as Kepler Station's rescue ships reached them. As they were transferred to the safety of the massive space station, Zayla kept looking back toward the debris field where the celestial wing had been destroyed. "Is he really gone, Mama?" she asked. Thyra's mental voice was sad but also thoughtful. "His body may be gone, little flame, but what he did today, what he showed us today, that will live on." That night, safe in the refugee quarters of Kepler Station, Zayla dreamed of a simple human mechanic who had refused to accept that some problems couldn't be solved. When she woke, she found her mother staring out at the stars. "Mama, what are you thinking about?" Thyra turned to her daughter, and for the first time in cycles, there was something other than despair in the ancient dragon's eyes. "I'm thinking, little flame, that perhaps we've been fighting the Devourers the wrong way. Perhaps what we need isn't bigger weapons or stronger shields. What do we need?" "Perhaps what we need," Thyra said quietly, "is to learn to think like a human." 6 months had passed since the evacuation of the Celestial Wing, and Zayla found herself in the most unlikely place imaginable for a young dragon, the human colony world of New Geneva. The planet was nothing like the grand crystalline cities of her homeworld or the floating gardens of the Centaurian systems. New Geneva was practical, utilitarian, built by a species that valued function over form. The buildings were simple geometric shapes designed to withstand the planet's harsh weather patterns, and everything seemed to be built with the assumption that it would need to be repaired, upgraded, or completely rebuilt at some point. Zayla liked it immediately. She and Her mother had come here as part of a refugee relocation program, but that wasn't the real reason for their visit. In the months following their rescue, word had spread throughout the galaxy about the human mechanic who had saved over 200 lives with nothing but ingenuity and spare parts. The story had taken on an almost mythical quality, growing with each telling until some versions had Marcus Chin single-handedly fighting off Devourer's ships while simultaneously performing impossible engineering feats. But Thyra was interested in the truth behind the myth. She wanted to understand how a member of such a young species had been able to solve problems that had stumped some of the galaxy's most advanced civilizations. More importantly, she wanted to know if other humans possessed similar capabilities. The human approach to problem-solving is fundamentally different from our own, Thyra had explained to the Galactic Council during their last session on Kepler Station. Where we see obstacles, they see puzzles. Where we see limitations, they see challenges to overcome. If we could learn to think like they do, perhaps we could finally find a way to stop the Devourers. The Council had been skeptical, as usual. The elder races had spent millennia developing their technologies and philosophies. The idea that they could learn something useful from a species that had only recently discovered how to build starships seemed absurd to most of them. But Thyra was not most of them. She was old enough to remember when the Zephyrites had been a young species, struggling to understand the harmonic frequencies that now made them masters of energy manipulation. She had watched the Verdians evolve from simple plant-like organisms into sophisticated biological engineers. She understood that wisdom didn't always correlate with age. So here they were, walking through the streets of New Geneva's capital city, looking for answers. "Mama, look at that," Zayla said, pointing toward a construction site where human workers were assembling what appeared to be a residential building. What caught her attention wasn't the building itself, but the way the humans were constructing it. Instead of using the massive gravity manipulators that most advanced species employed for such projects, the humans were using a combination of simple machines, mechanical tools, and what could only be described as creative problem-solving. One worker had rigged a pulley system using spare cable and a damaged gravity lift to move heavy materials up to the third floor. Another had modified a standard welding tool to serve as both a cutter and a power source for temporary lighting. A third was using some kind of handheld device to scan the building's structure, making real-time adjustments to the construction plan based on what the scanner revealed. "They're improvising," Thyra observed, her mental voice carrying a note of fascination. "Every aspect of this project is being modified on the fly based on immediate circumstances." "Is that bad?" Zayla asked. "Most species would consider it chaotic," Thyra replied. "We prefer to plan extensively before beginning any project. We run simulations, create detailed blueprints, account for every possible variable. But look at what they're accomplishing." The building was going up faster than any comparable project Zayla had seen on other worlds. More importantly, it looked solid, functional, and perfectly adapted to its environment. The humans hadn't just built a generic structure. They had created something specifically designed for the local climate, terrain, and available resources. "Excuse me," Thyra said, approaching one of the workers. "I am Matriarch Thyra of the Dragon Courts. Might I speak with your project supervisor?" The worker, a middle-aged woman with grease-stained coveralls and calloused hands, looked up from her scanner and smiled. "That would be me. Name's Sarah Kim. What can I do for you?" Zayla was surprised by the woman's casual demeanor. In most galactic civilizations, speaking to a dragon matriarch required formal protocols, elaborate ceremonies, and careful attention to ancient etiquette. But this human simply treated Thyra like another person who might need help with something. "We are here to learn about human engineering methods," Thyra explained. "Specifically, your species' approach to solving complex technical problems." Sarah's eyebrows rose slightly. "That's a pretty broad topic. Any particular reason you're interested?" Thyra explained about the incident with the Celestial Wing, about Marcus Chen's sacrifice, and about her theory that human ingenuity might be the key to developing new strategies against the Devourers. "Marcus Chen," Sarah repeated thoughtfully. "Yeah, I heard about that. Hell of a thing he did." She wiped her hands on a rag and gestured toward the construction site. Tell you what, why don't you spend the day with us? See how we actually work. Might be more educational than any theoretical discussion. Over the next several hours, Zayla watched her mother transform from an ancient, dignified dragon matriarch into something resembling an excited student. Sarah and her team didn't just show them human engineering techniques. They explained the philosophy behind them. See, most species try to solve problems by making their technology more advanced. Sarah explained while demonstrating how to modify a standard plasma cutter to work with locally available power sources. But we humans learned early on that more advanced doesn't always mean better. Sometimes the most elegant solution is the simplest one. She handed Thyra the modified tool. Try it. Zayla watched in amazement as her 3,000-year-old mother, who had mastered some of the most sophisticated technologies in known space, fumbled with a simple human device like a hatchling learning to fly. The power coupling is different, Thyra observed. Exactly, Sarah said. We designed it to work with whatever power source happens to be available, rather than requiring a specific type of energy input. It's less efficient in ideal conditions, but much more versatile in real-world situations. Interesting, Thyra murmured, studying the tool's construction. You've sacrificed optimal performance for universal compatibility. It's a trade-off, Sarah agreed. But we've found that a tool that works adequately in all situations is usually more useful than a tool that works perfectly in only one situation. As the day progressed, Zayla began to understand what her mother was getting at. Human technology wasn't necessarily more advanced than what other species had developed, but it was fundamentally different in its approach. Where other races created specialized tools for specific tasks, humans created adaptable tools that could be modified for multiple purposes. It's because of your history, isn't it? Thyra asked during a break in the construction work. Your species developed on a world with limited resources and constantly changing environmental conditions. You had to learn to make do with what you had. That's part of it, Sarah agreed. But I think there's something more. We humans have this weird psychological quirk where we refuse to accept that some things are impossible. Even when all the evidence says a problem can't be solved, we keep trying anyway. That sounds like a significant evolutionary disadvantage, Thyra pointed out. Sarah laughed. You'd think so, wouldn't you? But it turns out that sometimes the things everyone knows are impossible actually aren't impossible at all. They're just really, really hard. That evening, Sarah invited them to her home for dinner. Zayla had expected something simple and functional, in keeping with what she'd observed of human architecture. Instead, she found herself in a space that was warm, comfortable, and filled with what could only be described as personality. The walls were covered with photographs, artwork, and what appeared to be technical diagrams for various projects Sarah had worked on. Shelves held an eclectic mix of books, tools, electronic components, and decorative objects from a dozen different worlds. Everything in the room seemed to serve multiple purposes, as if space were too precious to waste on single-function items. Your home reflects the same design philosophy as your work, Thyra observed. Never thought about it that way, but yeah, I guess it does, Sarah replied, pulling dishes from a cabinet that also contained spare parts for various machines. When you grow up in a colony world, you learn not to waste anything. That includes space, time, and opportunities. During dinner, they were joined by Sarah's husband, Dr. James Kim, who worked as a research physicist at the colony's university. The conversation quickly turned to the topic of the Devourers and the various strategies that have been attempted to stop them. The problem with fighting the Devourers, James explained, is that everyone's trying to beat them at their own game. The Devourers have incredibly advanced technology, so everyone assumes we need even more advanced technology to stop them. That seems logical, Zayla said. Sure, but it's also exactly what they'd expect us to do, Sarah added. What if the solution isn't to out-tech them, but to approach the whole problem from a completely different angle? What kind of different angle? Thyra asked. James and Sarah exchanged a look that suggested they'd had this conversation before. Well, James said carefully, we've been studying the reports from worlds that have encountered the Devourers. The pattern is always the same. They show up with overwhelming force, destroy all resistance, and then strip the planet of resources. It's a very efficient approach. Efficient, but also predictable, Sarah continued. They're so focused on overwhelming force that they might not know how to deal with tactics they've never encountered before. Such as, Thyra prompted, asymmetrical warfare, James said, hit and run tactics, guerrilla fighting, making the cost of conquest higher than the value of the resources they're trying to steal. But most civilizations don't know how to fight that way, Zayla pointed out. The Centaurians are warriors, but they believe in honorable combat. The Zephyrites prefer negotiations. The Verdians are pacifists by nature. Exactly, Sarah said. But humans? We've been fighting asymmetrical wars for our entire history. We know how to be sneaky, how to be unpredictable, how to turn an enemy's strengths into weaknesses. Thyra was quiet for a long moment, her golden eyes distant with thought. You're suggesting that we stop trying to match the Devourer's technological advantages and instead exploit their tactical limitations. More than that, James said. We're suggesting that the galaxy's various species need to learn to work together in ways they never have before. Combine Centaurian warrior culture with human tactical flexibility. Use Zephyrite energy manipulation to power Verdian biological weapons. Mix dragon wisdom with human stubbornness. Create something new, Sarah added. Something the Devourers have never seen before and won't know how to counter. That night, lying in the comfortable guest room that the Kims had prepared for them, Zayla found herself thinking about everything she'd learned. The humans weren't individually stronger or smarter than other species, but they had something that seemed increasingly rare in the galaxy, an absolute refusal to accept defeat. Mama, she said into the darkness, do you really think humans could teach us how to fight the Devourers? I think, little flame, the humans might teach us something even more important, Thyra replied. They might teach us how to hope again. The next morning brought unexpected visitors. Zayla woke to the sound of voices in the Kim's living room, and when she and her mother emerged from their guest room, they found Sarah deep in conversation with three figures that made Zayla's breath catch. The first was Commander Vex, the captain of a destroyed celestial wing. The second was Dr. Yelena, the Zephyrite researcher who had argued about pod capacity. The third was someone Zayla didn't recognize, a tall, lean human with intelligent eyes and clothes that marked him as either military or government. Commander Vex, Thyra said, surprised. I didn't expect to see you here. Nor I you, matriarch, Vex replied. But it seems we all had the same idea. We came here looking for answers, Dr. Yelena added, her crystalline form flickering with complex patterns of light. After what happened on your transport, we wanted to understand how one human was able to save us all. And you? Thyra asked, turning to the unknown human. Colonel David Harrison, the man replied, extending his hand in the human gesture of greeting. I represent the Terran Defense Initiative. We've been monitoring the situation with the Devourers, and we have a proposal. Sarah gestured for everyone to sit down. The colonel was just explaining an interesting idea. The various galactic civilizations have been fighting the Devourers individually, Harrison began. Each species using their own tactics, their own technology, their own strategic doctrines. It's not working. No, Commander Vex agreed grimly. It's not. But what if we tried something different? Harrison continued. What if we created a joint task force, combining the best elements of each civilization into something completely new? A mongrel force with no unified command structure or tactical doctrine, Dr. Yelena said skeptically. It would be chaos. Yes, Harrison replied with a slight smile. It would be chaos. And the Devourers have never had to deal with chaos before. He pulled out a data pad and activated a holographic display showing star maps, tactical analyses, and what appear to be preliminary operational plans. The human government has been developing contingency plans for a Devourer attack on our worlds, he explained. We know we can't match their technology, so we've been planning for asymmetrical warfare from the beginning. Hit and run raids, resource denial tactics, guerrilla operations designed to make occupation so costly that it becomes economically unfeasible. But We can't do it alone, Sarah added. We need partners. Species with capabilities we don't have. Dragon telepathic networks for instant communication across vast distances, Harrison said, nodding toward Thyra. Zephyrite energy manipulation for power sources, and weapons that can't be easily detected or countered. Verdian biological engineering for adaptive equipment and camouflage. Centaurian warrior culture for small unit tactics and morale. And what do humans bring to this alliance? Commander Vex asked. Experience with impossible odds, Harrison replied simply. And a complete inability to know when we're beaten. Dr. Yelena's crystalline form flashed with what Zayla had learned to recognize as the Zephyrite equivalent of laughter. You want to create a military force based on stubbornness and improvisation. I want to create a military force based on adaptation and unpredictability, Harrison corrected. The Devourers win because they're stronger, faster, and more technologically advanced than anyone they fight. But they win in predictable ways. If we can force them to fight a war they don't understand, using tactics they've never encountered, we might actually have a chance, Thyra finished, her mental voice carrying a note of growing excitement. It would require unprecedented cooperation between species that have been essentially isolated from each other for millennia, Commander Vex pointed out. It would require individuals willing to abandon the tactical doctrines of their own civilizations in favor of something completely untested, Dr. Yelena added. It would require people crazy enough to believe that a small group of determined individuals can change the course of history, Sarah said with a grin. So, Harrison said, looking around the room at the assembled representatives of 5 different species, anyone interested in starting a revolution? Zayla felt something stirring in her chest, something she hadn't felt since before the Devourers had destroyed her homeworld. It took her a moment to recognize what it was. Hope. I want to help, she said suddenly, surprised by the strength of her own voice. The adults all turned to look at her, and she felt her cheeks warm with embarrassment. But then, Thyra's wing settled gently across her shoulders, a gesture of support that gave her courage to continue. Marcus Chun saved all of us, she said. Not because he was the strongest or the smartest, but because he refused to give up. If we're going to honor his sacrifice, then we need to learn to think like he did. We need to stop accepting that some problems can't be solved. Out of the mouths of hatchlings, Thyra murmured, pride evident in her mental voice. The girl's right, Harrison said. This isn't just about military tactics or technology. It's about changing how we think about the Devourers. Instead of seeing them as an unstoppable force of nature, we need to start seeing them as a problem that can be solved. A problem that will be solved, Sarah corrected. Because that's what humans do. We solve problems that everyone else thinks are impossible. As the discussion continued, Zayla found herself thinking about Marcus Chun and his quiet confidence in the face of certain death. He had saved them not through superior firepower or advanced technology, but through ingenuity, determination, and an absolute refusal to accept defeat. Maybe, she thought, that was exactly what the galaxy needed. The training facility on asteroid Mining Station Omega 7 looked like organized chaos to most visitors. What had once been a sterile industrial complex had been transformed into something that defied easy categorization. Dragon-designed meditation chambers sat next to human-built obstacle courses. Zephyrite harmonic training rooms were connected to Verdian biological laboratories through Centaurian combat arenas. Zayla, now 14 cycles old and considerably taller than she'd been on New Geneva, ducked under a beam of coherent energy that would have taken her head off if her reflexes had been a fraction slower. The training simulation was designed to test the integration of different species' abilities under combat conditions, and it was proving to be far more challenging than anyone had anticipated. Left side, incoming plasma burst, called out her training partner, a young human named Alex Martinez who had joined the program 6 months earlier. His warning came through both audible speech and the telepathic network that Zayla had learned to maintain, allowing for near-instantaneous communication across the training ground. She rolled right instead, trusting the human's tactical assessment, but following her own dragon instincts about the best escape route. The plasma burst struck where she would have been if she'd followed Alex's suggestion exactly. But her modified path took her through a gap in the simulated enemy fire that the human's eyes had missed. Nice adaptation. Came another voice through the network, this one belonging to Krina, a young Verdian who was providing biological camouflage for their simulated infiltration mission. Human tactical analysis combined with dragon spatial awareness equals optimal path calculation. Zayla smiled as she reached the objective, a mock devourer command node that they needed to disable. The mission was a success, but more importantly, it represented something that would have been impossible just 2 years earlier. Seamless cooperation between 3 species that had barely known each other existed before the joint training program began. The program itself had grown far beyond what anyone had originally envisioned. What had started as a theoretical discussion in Sarah Kim's living room had become a full-scale interspecies military initiative sponsored jointly by the Human Colonial Defense Force, the Dragon Courts, the Zephyrite Harmonies, the Verdian Collective, and even the traditionally isolationist Centaurian warrior houses. Exercise complete. Announce the simulation's AI in the precise, neutral tones that all species found acceptable. Performance evaluation follows. The training ground's holographic projectors shut down, revealing the stark metal walls of the asteroid facility. Zayla, Alex, and Krina gathered with a dozen other young beings who comprised Training Group 7, waiting for their instructor to arrive. They didn't have to wait long. Colonel Harrison entered the chamber with the purposeful stride that Zayla had come to associate with human military efficiency, followed by an unusual companion, a figure in the distinctive robes of a Dragon Court elder. Elder Voss, Zayla said, dropping into the formal bow required by dragon etiquette. The other young dragons in their group followed suit, while the non-dragon members of the team offered their own species appropriate gestures of respect. At ease, Elder Voss said, his mental voice carrying the authority of someone who had lived through the rise and fall of several galactic civilizations. I'm here to observe, not to inspect. Colonel Harrison activated his portable hologram projector, filling the center of the room with a 3-dimensional tactical display. Today's exercise was designed to test your ability to integrate different species combat doctrines under realistic battlefield conditions. The good news is that you're getting better at working together. And the bad news? Alex asked. The bad news is that you're still thinking like separate species who happen to be working together, instead of thinking like a unified force with diverse capabilities, Harrison replied. Dr. Yelena, would you join us, please? The Zephyrite researcher materialized in the doorway with the characteristic shimmer that marked her species' ability to manipulate light and energy. Over the past 2 years, she had become one of the joint program's most valuable assets, not just for her technical expertise, but for her ability to analyze how different species' thought processes could be integrated. Show them the replay of the final approach sequence, she requested, her crystalline form flickering with patterns of light that Zayla had learned to interpret as focused concentration. The holographic display shifted to show their recent training exercise from a tactical analysis perspective. Zayla watched herself, Alex, and Krina approach the target, their movements tracked by the simulation's monitoring systems. Notice how each of you defaulted to your species' standard tactical doctrine when under pressure, Dr. Yelena pointed out. Zayla, you used dragon stealth techniques. Alex, you applied human rapid response protocols. Krina, you fell back on Verdian biological adaptation strategies. But we succeeded, Krina said, her bioluminescent patterns shifting to indicate confusion. We completed the mission. Yes, you did, Elder Voss acknowledged. And, against most opponents, that would be sufficient. But the Devourers are not most opponents. They have been adapting to standard tactical doctrines for centuries. What we need is something they've never seen before. Colonel Harrison manipulated the holographic display, showing alternative approach routes that the simulation's analysis had calculated. What if, instead of each of you using your species' preferred tactics, you had created something entirely new? Zayla's spatial awareness, combined with Alex's rapid decision-making and Kreena's biological adaptability. The display showed a theoretical approach that was unlike anything from any single species' tactical manual. It involved rapid, shape-changing to exploit brief openings, instantaneous communication to coordinate complex maneuvers, and spatial manipulation that defied traditional understanding of battlefield geometry. It would require perfect trust between team members, Dr. Yelena observed. And abandoning everything we've been taught about how to fight, Alex added. Which is exactly why it might work, Elder Voss said. The Devourers have conquered dozens of civilizations by adapting to their tactical doctrines. They study how their enemies fight, develop countermeasures, and then overwhelm them with superior technology applied through superior tactical analysis. But they've never fought anything like us, Zayla said slowly, beginning to understand. There is no us yet, Colonel Harrison corrected gently. Right now, there's a group of young beings from different species who are learning to work together. What we need is something more, a genuinely new form of consciousness that combines the best of each species while transcending the limitations of any single one. Over the following weeks, Training Group 7 became the testing ground for increasingly experimental approaches to interspecies cooperation. They learned to share not just information through Thyra's telepathic networks, but actual thought processes. Dr. Yelena developed techniques for using Zephyrite energy manipulation to enhance Dragon's spatial awareness. Kreena's biological engineering allowed for temporary physiological modifications that let different species literally see through each other's eyes. The results were unprecedented and occasionally terrifying. During one training exercise, Zayla found herself temporarily linked not just telepathically, but neurologically with Alex and two other humans. For a brief, disorienting moment, she experienced reality from a human perspective. Linear time instead of the fluid temporal awareness natural to dragons. Pattern recognition that relied on visual processing rather than intuitive understanding, and an emotional landscape that was both more intense and more narrowly focused than anything in dragon psychology. How do you stand it? She asked Alex afterward, still shaky from the experience. Everything is so immediate, so urgent. There's no time to consider all the possibilities. How do you stand the opposite? Alex replied with a slightly stunned expression. I could see every possible outcome simultaneously, but I couldn't choose between them. It was like being paralyzed by infinite options. Dr. Yelena, who had been monitoring their vital signs during the linkage, was practically vibrating with excitement. Do you realize what just happened? You each gained access to cognitive processes that your species has never developed. Zayla experienced human rapid response decision-making. Alex experienced dragon multidimensional analysis, and nearly went insane from it. Kreena pointed out her bioluminescent patterns showing concern. Growing pains, Colonel Harrison said. But growing toward what exactly? That question was answered 3 days later when Training Group 7 faced their most challenging simulation yet. A scenario based on actual devourer attack patterns, using real-time intelligence gathered from the few survivors of recent incursions. The exercise began like all the others, with the team scattered across a mock battlefield representing a colony world under assault. But this time, instead of falling back on species-specific tactics, they attempted something that had never been tried before, a genuinely integrated response that drew on all their species' capabilities simultaneously. Zayla felt Alex's tactical awareness merge with her spatial perception, creating a three-dimensional battlefield analysis that was both immediate and comprehensive. Kreena's biological adaptability flowed through the telepathic network, allowing all team members to modify their approaches in real time based on changing conditions. The Zephyrite and Centaurian team members added their own capabilities to the mix, creating something that was greater than the sum of its parts. They moved across the simulated battlefield like a single organism with multiple bodies, each individual maintaining their own identity, while simultaneously participating in a collective consciousness that saw everything, understood everything, and responded to threats with inhuman speed and precision. The simulation's AI, programmed with actual Devourer tactical responses, was completely unable to counter their approach. Every time it adapted to one team member's actions, the others had already shifted to exploit the adaptation. Every countermeasure was met by responses that shouldn't have been possible given the species involved. Exercise terminated, the AI announced after less than 6 minutes. Devourer force neutralized with 0 casualties to defending team. The training ground fell silent. Training Group 7 stood in the center of the chamber, still linked through Thyra's telepathic network, sharing a collective sense of achievement that transcended anything any of them had experienced individually. "Well," Colonel Harrison said finally, his voice carrying a note of awe, "I think we just invented a new form of warfare." Elder Voss was less enthusiastic. "You also just invented a new form of consciousness," he said, his mental voice carrying both wonder and concern. "The question is whether that's a good thing or a catastrophically dangerous thing." Dr. Yelena was already analyzing the data from the exercise, her crystalline form flickering through complex patterns as she processed the information. "The level of integration you achieved should have been impossible given the neurological differences between your species. You created temporary cognitive bridges that allowed for genuine shared consciousness while maintaining individual identity. It felt," Zayla began, then struggled to find words for the experience. "It felt like being more myself than I've ever been, while simultaneously being part of something larger." "Human philosophers have written about this concept for centuries," Alex added. "The idea of a collective consciousness that enhances rather than diminishes individual identity. We just never thought it was actually possible." "It shouldn't be possible," Elder Voss insisted. "Dragon minds have never been designed to interface so directly with other species. The psychological risks alone are probably outweighed by the potential benefits," Colonel Harrison interrupted. "If Training Group 7 can achieve this level of integration, we might actually have a chance against the Devourers. And if the integration proves unstable or harmful?" Elder Voss asked. "Then we'll have to find another way," Zayla said firmly. "But we can't let fear of unknown risks prevent us from exploring unknown possibilities. According to my analysis, they would be effective against actual Devourer forces." She manipulated the holographic display to show comparative tactical analyses. "The Devourers have adapted to counter every known form of warfare. But this," she gestured to the data from their exercise, "this is genuinely unprecedented. It combines elements from multiple species combat doctrines in ways that create entirely new tactical possibilities." "New enough to actually surprise them?" Alex asked. "New enough to give us an advantage," Dr. Yelena replied. "At least initially. The Devourers are fast learners, but they've never encountered anything like this before." Colonel Harrison was quiet for a long moment, studying the tactical analysis with the focused attention that Zayla had learned to associate with humans making important decisions. Finally, he looked up at the assembled team. "I'm going to recommend that Training Group 7 be advanced to active duty status," he said, "with full interspecies integration authorization." "They're still children," Elder Voss protested. "So was I when I enlisted," Alex pointed out. "So were most humans when we started fighting for survival. And I was barely past hatchling stage when I met Marcus Chun," Zayla added. "Age doesn't determine readiness. Capability does." Elder Voss studied each member of Training Group 7 with the ancient wisdom that came from living through the rise and fall of civilizations. "Very well," he said finally, "but understand that what you're proposing to do has never been attempted before. You're not just soldiers. You're explorers venturing into uncharted territory of consciousness itself." "That sounds like exactly the kind of impossible thing that humans specialize in," Krina observed, her bioluminescent patterns shifting to indicate amusement. "In that case," Colonel Harrison said with a slight smile, "welcome to the war." That night, as Zayla lay in her quarters aboard Omega 7, she found herself thinking about the path that had brought her here. 2 years ago, she had been a frightened refugee, saved by human mechanics' ingenuity and sacrifice. Now she was part of something that had never existed before, a genuinely integrated multi-species military force capable of tactics that no single civilization could have developed alone. Tomorrow, Training Group 7 would begin preparing for their first real mission against Devourer forces. It would be dangerous, possibly suicidal, and definitely unprecedented. But for the first time since the Devourers had begun their conquest of the galaxy, there was a genuine reason for hope. As she drifted off to sleep, Zayla's last conscious thought was a silent message of gratitude to Marcus Chun, wherever his spirit might be. We learned to think like humans, just like Mama said we should. And maybe, just maybe, that's going to be enough to save everyone. The asteroid field designated as Sector 7 Alpha looked like a graveyard in space. Twisted metal fragments that had once been Centaurian warships drifted among chunks of rock and ice, while the burned-out hulk of what had been the mining station Haven's Rest tumbled slowly end over end, venting atmosphere through dozens of hull breaches. Zayla watched the destruction through the viewport of the stealth ship Harmony's Edge, her heart heavy with the knowledge that they had arrived too late to save the station's 10,000 inhabitants. Intelligence reports had indicated that the Devourers would attack Haven's Rest, but the Joint Task Force had underestimated how quickly the enemy could move once they had committed to an assault. 3 hours, Alex said quietly, reading from his tactical display. The entire battle lasted 3 hours from first contact to complete annihilation. The Centaurian Defense Fleet never had a chance, added Lieutenant Commander Vex, who had joined Training Group 7 as their primary tactical advisor after the success of their integration exercises. The Devourers used their standard, overwhelming force doctrine. Massive ships, concentrated firepower, no quarter given. Zayla felt the familiar stirring of rage that always accompanied encounters with Devourer atrocities. But this time she forced herself to channel that emotion through the techniques she had learned during integration training. Instead of allowing anger to cloud her judgment, she let it flow through the telepathic network she shared with her team members, where it was processed, refined, and transformed into cold tactical analysis. "They're still here," she said, her enhanced senses picking up energy signatures that the ship's conventional scanners had missed. 3 vessels, holding position behind the large asteroid cluster approximately 2 million kilometers from the station. "Confirmed," said Specialist Krina, whose biological sensors have been enhanced through Zephyrite energy manipulation to provide capabilities far beyond what any single species could achieve. "I'm detecting Devourer biosignatures and energy patterns consistent with their standard post-conquest salvage operations." Dr. Yelena's crystalline form flickered with patterns of light that indicated intense calculation. "They're waiting for something. Standard doctrine calls for immediate resource extraction and departure. There's no tactical reason for them to linger." "Unless they know we're coming," suggested Mira, 6, a Zephyrite specialist whose harmonic abilities have been integrated with human tactical programming to create unprecedented electronic warfare capabilities. Colonel Harrison, commanding from the Harmony's Edge S Bridge, activated the ship's internal communication system. "All teams, prepare for reconnaissance approach. Remember, we're here to gather intelligence, not to engage. The Devourers have never faced integrated tactics before, and we want to keep it that way until we're ready to commit fully." The ship moved deeper into the asteroid field with the silent grace that came from combining human stealth technology with Dragon's spatial awareness. Zayla found herself simultaneously experiencing the approach from her own perspective and from those of her team members, creating a multidimensional understanding of their tactical situation that no single species military doctrine had ever contemplated. Through Alex's eyes, she saw the battlefield in terms of cover positions, firing lanes, and tactical opportunities. Through Krina's biological sensors, she experienced the electromagnetic signatures of the Devourer ships like physical presences in space. Through Mira 6's harmonic perception, she could actually hear the enemy vessel's energy patterns as complex musical compositions that revealed details about their power systems, weapon configurations, and crew activity levels. "Interesting," Dr. Yelena observed through the telepathic network. "The Devourer ships are operating at minimal power levels, but their weapon systems are fully charged. They're trying to appear inactive while remaining ready for immediate combat. It's a trap, concluded tactical specialist Thorne, a young Centaurian whose warrior instincts have been enhanced through integration with human analytical capabilities. They're using Haven's Rest as bait. For what? Alex asked. The answer came from an unexpected source. Elder Voss, who had insisted on joining the mission despite concerns about his advanced age, suddenly stiffened with an expression of shock that was visible even through his formal dragon composure. "They're not hunting us," he said, his mental voice carrying a note of horror that made everyone in the telepathic network freeze. "They're studying us." He gestured toward the tactical display, where new information was beginning to appear as their enhanced sensors penetrated deeper into the asteroid field. "Look at the debris patterns. The Devourers didn't just destroy the Centaurian defense fleet. They disabled specific ships and captured their crews." "Prisoners?" Zayla asked, confused. "But the Devourers don't take prisoners. They never have." "No," Elder Voss agreed grimly. "They don't take prisoners for ransom or exchange. But they might take test subjects if they were trying to understand new forms of warfare." The implications hit everyone simultaneously. If the Devourers had become aware of the Joint Task Force's integrated tactics, they might be conducting experiments to understand how different species could work together so effectively. The crews of the destroyed Centaurian ships would provide perfect subjects for that kind of research. "We have to help them," Zayla said immediately. "It's a trap," Thorne repeated. "A perfect trap. They know we'll try to rescue the prisoners, and they're prepared for it." "Then we don't do what they expect," Alex said, his tactical mind already working through possibilities. "They're prepared for standard rescue operations. They're probably even prepared for our integrated tactics, assuming they've been monitoring our training exercises. But they're not prepared for something completely new." "What did you have in mind?" Colonel Harrison asked over the comm. Alex looked around at his team members, and Zayla could feel his thoughts flowing through the telepathic network as he developed a plan that was equal parts brilliant and completely insane. "We don't rescue the prisoners," he said finally. "We let ourselves get captured." The silence that followed was so complete that Zayla could hear the ship's life support systems cycling air through the ventilation system. "Explain," Dr. Yelena requested, her crystalline form flickering with patterns that indicated she was already running complex calculations based on Alex's preliminary thoughts. "The Devourers want to study integrated tactics," Alex continued. "They've set up a perfect laboratory scenario. Isolated location, available test subjects, controlled conditions. But they're assuming we'll approach as attackers, trying to free prisoners, instead of as additional test subjects offering ourselves for study," Zayla finished, beginning to understand the audacity of what Alex was proposing. "It's brilliant," Krina observed, her bioluminescent patterns shifting to indicate excitement. "They'll capture us, thinking they're gaining valuable research material. But once we're inside their ship, we'll have access to their internal systems, their research data, and their command structure," Mira, 6 added. "Plus the element of surprise when we reveal that we're not helpless prisoners, but a fully integrated tactical team." "It's also suicidal," Thorne pointed out. "If the plan fails, we'll all be dead or worse." "Every plan we've considered is suicidal," Elder Voss said with the philosophical acceptance that came from 3 millennia of life experience. "The question is whether this particular form of suicide might actually accomplish something useful." Colonel Harrison's voice came over the comm with a carefully controlled tone that Zayla had learned meant he was considering options he didn't like. "Even if the infiltration succeeds, how do you plan to escape? Devourer ships are designed to be impenetrable from the inside." "That's where Marcus Chun comes in," Zayla said, surprising herself with the confidence in her voice. "He taught us that problems that seem impossible usually aren't impossible at all. They're just really, really hard." She activated her personal data pad and began pulling up technical specifications that she had been studying for months. Detailed analysis of Devourer ship construction based on fragments recovered from destroyed vessels, theoretical weaknesses identified through collaborative research between human engineers and Dragon technicians, energy pattern analyses provided by Zephyrite scientists. "Look," she said, projecting the information onto the team's shared display. Devourer ships are incredibly advanced, but they're also incredibly standardized. They use the same power distribution systems, the same internal layouts, the same security protocols across their entire fleet. Standardization that makes them efficient, Dr. Yelena observed, but also predictable. Exactly, Zayla agreed. And we've been trained to exploit predictability. Over the next hour, they developed what was probably the most audacious military plan in galactic history. Using techniques borrowed from human special operations, dragon stealth capabilities, Verdian biological adaptation, Zephyrite energy manipulation, and Centaurian warrior psychology, they would allow themselves to be captured by the Devourers while retaining the ability to coordinate through hidden telepathic networks. Once inside the enemy ship, they would use their integrated capabilities to access critical systems, free the captured Centaurians, and gather intelligence about Devourer technology and tactics. Then, instead of trying to escape conventionally, they would turn the ship's own systems against it, using the kind of improvised engineering that Marcus Chun had exemplified. The most dangerous part, Alex noted as they finalized their preparations, will be convincing the Devourers that we're actually helpless prisoners while maintaining our telepathic network without detection. Leave that to me, Elder Voss said. Dragon minds are naturally shielded against most forms of telepathic detection. I can create a psychic camouflage that will make our network invisible to their sensors. And if they have countermeasures we don't know about? Thorne asked. Then, we improvise, Zayla said firmly. That's what humans do best. And that's what we've learned to do. The Harmony's Edge moved into position with all the stealth capabilities that their joint technology could provide. From the outside, it appeared to be a standard refugee transport, the kind of vessel that often fled from Devourer attacks. The team had even created false energy signatures that would make it seem like their ship was damaged and barely functional. Remember, Colonel Harrison said as they prepared to launch their deception, once you're aboard that Devourer ship, you'll be on your own. We can't provide support or extraction. If this plan fails, it won't fail, Zayla said with conviction that surprised even herself. Marcus Chun saved 200 people by refusing to accept that some problems can't be solved. We're going to save 10,000 people the same way. Plus gather intelligence that could change the entire course of the war, Alex added. Plus prove that integrated tactics can work against the Devourers in real combat conditions, Krina contributed. Plus rescue prisoners and strike a blow against enemies who think they're invincible, Mira 6 said. Plus honor the memory of everyone who has died fighting these monsters, Thorne concluded. Elder Voss looked around at the young beings who had become something unprecedented in galactic history, a genuine fusion of multiple species' capabilities into a form of consciousness that was greater than the sum of its parts. Very well, he said with the dignity that came from 3,000 years of accumulated wisdom. Let us go teach the Devourers what it means to face beings who have learned to think like humans. The Harmony's Edge began broadcasting distress signals as it limped toward the asteroid field where the Devourer ships waited. On the bridge, Colonel Harrison watched his instruments as enemy vessels moved to intercept, their own sensors probing his ship for signs of deception. In the cargo hold, Training Group 7 made final preparations for what might be the most important mission in galactic history. They checked their equipment, verified their telepathic connections, and prepared themselves mentally for whatever horrors they might encounter aboard a Devourer vessel. Whatever happens, Zayla said to her team as the enemy ships closed in, remember that we're not just fighting for ourselves. We're fighting for every species that has ever refused to surrender to inevitable defeat. Through the viewport, she could see the sleek, predatory shapes of Devourer vessels moving to surround them. In a few minutes, they would be prisoners aboard enemy ships, facing creatures that had conquered half the galaxy through superior technology and ruthless efficiency. But for the first time since the war began, those creatures would be facing something they had never encountered before. Beings who had learned to combine the technological sophistication of ancient civilizations with a stubborn refusal to surrender that mark humanity's approach to impossible problems. "Contact in 30 seconds," Colonel Harrison announced. Zayla closed her eyes and felt the presence of her team members through their shared telepathic network. Together, they were something new under the stars, living proof that when different species truly learned to work together, they could become capable of things that none of them could achieve alone. The Devourers were about to discover that there were still some surprises left in the galaxy. The interior of the Devourer ship was unlike anything Zayla had ever experienced, and she had to fight to keep her revulsion from bleeding through the telepathic network to her teammates. The walls weren't metal or composite materials like those found in normal spacecraft. They were something organic, something that pulsed with its own rhythm and exuded a smell that made her dragon senses recoil. Biological technology, Krina's voice whispered through their hidden mental link, her expertise in living systems providing context for what they were seeing. The ship itself is alive, or at least partially alive. That's why Devourer vessels move so fluidly in space. They had been captured 6 hours ago, their ship disabled by Devourer tractor beams, and their crew supposedly stunned into unconsciousness by neural disruptors. The reality was more complex. Elder Voss had used advanced dragon telepathic techniques to simulate unconsciousness while maintaining their hidden network, allowing them to appear helpless while remaining fully aware and coordinated. Now they found themselves in what could only be described as a laboratory, though it bore no resemblance to the sterile research facilities of civilized species. The walls were lined with alcoves containing various captured beings, most unconscious, some clearly being subjected to procedures that Zayla didn't want to think about too closely. Centaurians from the defense fleet. Alex observed his tactical analysis flowing through their shared consciousness as he identified prisoners from Haven's Rest. They're alive, but something's been done to them. Neural implants of some kind. Through Mira Success enhanced harmonic perception, they could hear the electromagnetic signatures of the implants, complex devices that seemed to be monitoring and recording the prisoner's thoughts, memories, and even basic neural patterns. They're not just studying our tactics. Dr. Yelena realized, her scientific expertise adding context to what they were observing. They're trying to understand how different species think, how we process information, how we make decisions. Knowledge they can use to develop countermeasures, Thorne added grimly. The Devourers themselves were even more disturbing than their technology. Zayla had seen intelligence reports, but nothing had prepared her for the reality of beings that had once been similar to other civilized species, but had been transformed into something that barely qualified as alive. Their captors moved with mechanical precision through the laboratory, but there was something wrong with their movements, something that suggested their bodies were no longer entirely under their own control. Their eyes held a glittering intelligence, but it was cold and calculating, devoid of anything that resembled normal emotion or empathy. They've been modified, Elder Voss observed through the network, his ancient wisdom providing insight into what they were witnessing. Cybernetic implants, biological alterations, psychological conditioning. They're still the original Hectar species, but they've been transformed into something else. Transformed by what? Zayla asked. Unknown, Elder Voss replied. But whatever did this to them represents a threat far beyond simple conquest. They're not just trying to control territory. They're trying to control consciousness itself. One of the Devourers approached their group, its movements accompanied by the soft whirring of mechanical components and the wet sound of biological processes. When it spoke, its voice was a harmony of organic vocal cords and artificial voice modulators. Subjects display unusual neural coherence despite successful stun protocols. It observed, apparently speaking to itself or to some unseen monitor. Recommend immediate implantation before consciousness patterns stabilize. Through their shared network, Zayla felt her team members' tension spike. If the Devourers implanted them with the same neural devices they had used on the Centaurians, their hidden telepathic coordination would be detected immediately. Wait! Alex's voice came through their mental link, carrying the calm confidence that marked his best tactical insights. Don't resist yet. Let them try to implant us. Are you insane? Thorn's warrior instincts were screaming in protest. Those devices will compromise everything. Only if they work the way the Devourers expect them to, Alex replied. But we're not like the other species they've captured. We're integrated. Our neural patterns are already interconnected in ways they've never encountered before. Zayla felt Dr. Yelena's scientific curiosity engage as she followed Alex's reasoning. The implants are designed to monitor and control individual consciousness, she realized. But we don't have individual consciousness anymore. We have collective consciousness distributed across multiple beings. The implants might not be able to process that kind of neural architecture, Krina added, her biological expertise suggesting possibilities that no single species would have considered. It's incredibly risky, Elder Voss warned. If the implantation fails to be controlled by us, we'll be completely compromised. And if we resist now, we'll never get another chance to strike at the heart of their operation, Alex pointed out. This is what Marcus Chen would do. Take the impossible risk because it's the only option that leads to victory. The Devourer that had been examining them made some kind of gesture, and several more of the modified beings approached, carrying devices that were obviously designed for surgical implantation. Zayla forced herself to remain limp and apparently unconscious as cold metal instruments touched her skull. The implantation process was horrific in ways that she would never be able to adequately describe. She felt alien technology burrowing into her brain, establishing connections with her neural pathways and attempting to impose foreign patterns on